All right, cool. We'll go with the first run at this and we'll see how this intro rolls.
Perfect.
All right, three, two, and one. All right, I'm here with our guest, Chase Phelps, the Director of Sports Science at Stanford University. Chase has an amazing background, and I was fortunate enough to work underneath him at Stanford. Chase is more than versatile. He has a deep understanding in regards to human physiology, but also the technology involved in monitoring athletes and performance in general. So, Chase, I'll let you take it away here and kind of talk a little bit about yourself and the journey that you took to get to where you are. I personally have heard it multiple times. It's quite interesting. And for those listeners out there, it's going to be a good experience to hear exactly how someone of Chase's esteem got to where he is and how the road's not always quite a straight line.
Hmm. Well, I appreciate you having me on. You must be getting the checks in the mail to have that type of intro, because that's way over the top on how good I am on my job. But I appreciate it. So I think for me, it started. I think for a lot of us, being in the gym as an athlete, um, you know, kind of being one of those guys who's got to work harder to catch up with the other people who are kind of naturally talented. So I started off as your general meathead in the gym in high school, doing all the dumb uh, flat bench, incline bench, decline bench, pec deck, into all the flies you can do, and kind of started to figure out that I needed a more scientific way, I guess, to train myself, and started out going to a Velocity Sports Performance, and one of those big kind of box performance gyms, and got hooked up. Really lucky. Got hooked up with some people who at the time I didn't know were ahead of the game, but kind of started giving me the whys behind all the things I was doing in the gym, and started kind of carving that path for laying the foundation, so to say. So I went to undergrad, played lacrosse in college, and did the exercise science piece. Started the internships to be a traditional S&C coach on the floor. Um, uh, did let's see, Old Dominion, Radford, Virginia Tech, IMG Performance. Um, just kind of laying the coaching trenches, laying down in the trenches, and trying to kind of get myself the experience necessary to move ahead as a traditional S&C coach. So I got really lucky in that I got a job at Hampton University as an assistant, and within about 7 months of being there, the director at the time up and left, and they had nobody to help out with football. I got to take over, and really at an age that was way too young for me to be in that role. And so that was kind of my first, trial by fire experience, being 23 years old, heading up it was a one AA football program, but still a Division I football team where, I was pretty novice at the time. And while I didn't mess anything up too bad, it was definitely, I would change a lot of what I did at the time. So I look back on that experience, that it was extremely valuable. But from there, I actually had a stint where I was unemployed. So a little life lesson is I took somebody's word on a job without having it written out, and quit my job at Hampton thinking I had this position set up, and literally it fell through. The guy was like, "Hey, listen, it's not going to happen. I don't know what to tell you. I'm really sorry." So for 7 months, I worked at local gyms, private personal training athletes on the side, just basically doing anything I needed to do to maintain coaching, but also to keep an income going. And it's kind of funny because a lot of people don't appreciate that type of setting in the personal training. You're either a strength coach, it's not personal training, and a lot of the stuff that I do now, I still, I remember picking up because I was working with a client with rheumatoid arthritis, right? So like your ability to regress and appropriately choose exercise selections for somebody who's 60 years old and is not very mobile translates very well to return to play in an athlete who just had maybe an ACL surgery. And so I look back on that time as kind of a weird one in my life, but it was extremely valuable, in my experiences. So I got really lucky, and kind of the networking piece fell together, and ended up working with Naval Special Operations, and kind of finding a role in the human performance branch there, where I was there for a little over 3 years. I was just incredibly lucky to work with some of the people there, Mark Stevenson, and a lot of other guys who are still working there. They're still there now, but they're pushing the field forward. doing a lot of things behind the scenes that I think really kind of kicked off the sports sciencey kick in the U.S. in the last 6 to 8 years. And so I was really fortunate to kind of diversify my experiences there, really start looking at performance and training. Uh, I don't want to say like that buzzword of holistic, but just how am I diversifying my ability to understand what each discipline's doing, whether it's a mental performance coach, or nutritionist, or our physical therapist. But how can I better understand those fields to then, make sure that everything I'm doing is complementing what they're doing. And so I was able to land the job at Stanford initially just to run the sports science department. But I also got little coaching duties on the side as I work with men's soccer. So it's been all over the place, traditionally in athletics, but a little bit of Gen Pop here on the side as well.
So Chase bashfully passed over his lacrosse career, right? And how many was it? Multi-time All-American? Is that correct?
I had a couple years where I was pretty successful. So
And I think that's extremely important to highlight because being an athlete, you deal with all these departments firsthand. You see it from their perspective. And so one thing that Chase has really taught me is going forward is learning about how you continue to challenge yourself to put yourself into positions that other people are in. And how do you then think about your actions and what you're going to do as a sports scientist in regards to how it not only influences the athlete, but the coaches and the other staff around them. And being an athlete, you firsthand get to experience how it is to have someone else trying to intervene on your daily routine.
yeah.
And not to also mention that Chase is now someone who, I don't know what level of jujitsu he's in, but I know he's tough enough to beat the daylights out of me. And that's something as well he's taught me is that put yourself in situations where you have to be a beginner again and challenge yourself to have to learn from square one. We get caught in these ruts of progress. You go from a beginner where you first learn how to swing a baseball bat to now you're playing higher level traveling baseball and it's part of your life, or for myself, basketball. What Chase has taught me is really embrace those opportunities of struggle and whatever way that comes in its shape and form, and put you in those positions so you have the ability to actively learn from that. And now mentioning that, Chase, in regards to being an athlete, I think there's many things that we overlook. As coaches, we apply the idea of an external load, right? We give them sets and reps and weights, and we write out these long workouts for the next 6 months of what someone's going to do. But we can't predict the internal load. And being an athlete, you understand how it is to not sleep, how it is to maybe stay out a little too late with some of your friends, but how that affects you in regards to an athletic setting to reach the goals that you want to reach. So I want to dive into the topic a little bit about internal versus external load. That's something that you really challenged myself to learn about when I was with you. We talk about that in regards to HRV, sleep, and all the above. So I want to hear a little bit about your take on internal versus external load. What specifically is
touch on what you said as being an athlete. I think that goes, it's almost like every year that you are in the field, you separate yourself from what it feels like to go through the workouts and the daily grind, so to say, right? It's really easy to write up a card and have no thought process about how somebody feels on day 6 of a week where they've been pulling all day school, 2.5 hour, 3 hour practice, hour weights, and you're like, oh man, we got a great dynamic effort lower body session finished off with some, BFR lower body squats. But like, it's just really easy to forget how things can accumulate, and how you're just trying to kind of at times get through it all, and keep your head above water, whereas we're thinking about optimizing, where they may be thinking about, hey, I just need to put my head down and get through today. So I think that was a great point. But I think going on to the external load piece, obviously the US in the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years has exploded, trying to catch up maybe with Australia and the Europes of the world, who've been um, really kind of on the forefront of this objective collection of needs analysis for sport, whether that's an external load of what they're doing, the mechanical demands of the sport. So how far they're running, what are the physical characteristics that you see, the biomotor capabilities, as in, speeds, what velocities are they typically going to run? How many times are they going to change direction? Really kind of understanding the demands of the sport versus the internal loading piece, which you're going to be, how are these individuals responding to those demands? And I think the key word there being individual. We know that certain athletes are always going to be pushed and filtered into sports that they're uh, naturally good at, right? Like I think we all tend to favor things that we've been successful at. And as we kind of go up through our broken physical education system, we haven't done a really good job, I think, in our country of kind of diversifying and scaling appropriate levels to make sure people are developing in multiple ways. We kind of just like, oh, you're good at the sport, keep at it, you suck, you're out. And I think if we were to kind of cater developmentally appropriate skill acquisition techniques. And I'm just stealing all this from a classmate of mine, Peter Verdon, so he'd be proud, I think. But if we were to do a better job of scaling, developmental levels, I think you would see more athletes come out of that would be successful instead of just being like, oh, I'm the tall guy, put him under the basket. You would be able to develop more skills. But back to the internal load piece and understanding that, like, I work with men's soccer. Max, we were talking about this maybe a year ago. I have a guy who logged 20,000 meters in a playoff game last year. That's over 12 and a half miles, in one game. And he had played a game 2 days earlier and had been practicing for 4 months. And it comes to the question of like, how does somebody do that? Do you train them to do that? Do they just follow the program and all of a sudden they can do that? Or did their, I guess, internal demands to the sport over time, it took years, it took decades. And in my opinion, it took that athlete to play the sport at a high level, for 10 plus years to be able to get that cardiac adaptation, that peripheral ability to be so efficient that they can run and change and cut and jump at that intensity. And so an athlete like that internal load, they're going to be very, very effective at mobilizing energy. They're going to be very good at providing blood and oxygen to the outside of the body. Whereas, you take, not to hit on the sport, but like softball, that's a completely different athlete. And so if you were to ask them to have participate in similar demands, we know that internal load would be different. They're going to have an inefficiency that, what I would call like maybe a struggle to match the requirements of work or mechanical load that you're placing upon the athlete. So I think, it's really important as you start to look at that internal versus external. The external is critical. I think in a lot of sports, we're just now identifying what is necessary to be successful on the field, as in what they're doing. So you can start at that, backwards design and work your program to say, here's ultimately what they have to be able to do. This is a worst case scenario on the field. This is how we should cater our return to play protocols so that we know we're working towards ultimately the ideal player in that sport.
Interesting. Yeah. Not to cut you off, I just make some clarity here. In regards to internal versus external load, when we talk about external load, we're talking about the amount of work someone actually does.
Yes.
Right. So the amount of weight being lifted, how fast someone's running, how many pages someone can read.
Totally.
Right.
Yep.
In regards to
what it
internal. Sorry, go ahead.
It's really what is happening. What are you doing? How much of something?
Something you're applying to the body.
Yes.
And then the internal load is the physiological changes that take place. And so the most basic concept is, hey, we're going to give you a weight program. We're going to lift X amount of weights for X amount of days, with the external load intending to change the internal environment to grow muscle.
Yep,
and then
absolutely.
The more muscle you grow, the more internal load you can handle. So your adaptive capacity, that big bucket of how much you can handle in life, you become very efficient at handling that consistent external load, and you increase your ability, whether it be efficiently or the magnitude and size of that bucket, to handle a larger, external load in regards to having a larger internal capacity. And so what you're kind of talking about is when our bucket's very specific. Say we're playing soccer and we change to, let's say tennis, or in your case, softball. You mentioned the softball. player would struggle with soccer and the soccer player would struggle with tennis because those external loads are so different than the internal capabilities of that individual. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the higher level you go, you definitely see that specificity of coordinated skills really kind of become, I guess, very niched. And what you typically say, and I actually kind of think it's funny because I've said it, so I'm guilty as charged, is that you'll look at a soccer player, somebody who can play at the highest level and is sprinting, doing all these different, athletic exercises, and then we'll be like, man, they're a bad athlete. They can't skip. Or look at that squat pattern. That squat pattern's terrible. And you kind of take a step back, and you're like, well, was the goal to squat, or is the goal to score goals and play soccer? And then some, may argue, well, hey, the longevity piece. Are they going to be, more prone to injury? All that.
Hmm.
And at the same time, and I think about that subconscious competence. When you put somebody in a gym and a a new environment where they may not have done these things, they're very aware. They're consciously incompetent. They're sitting there going, "I suck at this," and they overthink it, right? And then you ask them to like go out on the field and kick a ball around, and they're doing these things. They're changing direction, which is basically a squat with shin angles changed. They're
Yeah.
doing these things fluently without even thinking about it. So it's like their ability is there. It's just not in the right context.
Interesting. Yeah. So you bring up the concept of someone being consciously aware, right? So they might be in a nervous kind of state. They're not familiar with the weight room. And that actually brings some level of anxiety, possibly. Is
Yep.
that true?
Yes.
And that itself may make the weight room, instead of a use stressor, which is something very positive, it might be a distressor. And so they see the weight room as negative. And so now they're nervous to work out and they have to work out, which makes the internal load even larger. So it makes
Absolutely.
this environment that kind of gets magnified. In
Yeah.
regards to that, what other factors influence your internal load? Something you kind of mentioned was that stress. And obviously, there are external stressors, especially at Stanford. We're very intelligent students who are having to go through rigorous testing and schooling, and it's a very competitive environment, not just athletically, but um, kind of the education side as well. Do those stressors impact your internal load? And if it does, how does that influence the amount of external load as a coach you might provide?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always going to be multifactorial. It's always going to be, it depends on who's the athlete, what's their background and the sport or the activity you're asking them to do. Um, the daily life, the 22 hours that they're not with you, are they hydrated? Are they eating properly? Are they fueling for adequate activity? Are they getting enough sleep? Are they, have a test? Are there psychosocial factors at play, like their girlfriend or boyfriend just broke up with them? I think all those things obviously have an impact. There's been a ton and ton of focus placed on this type of, I guess, capturing that whole athlete. Whereas maybe years ago you would look at tonnage, and now people want to
Hmm.
look at tonnage and what that stress load is, what that academic load is, because research is coming out now that we know that these types of overloaded stressors and stresses, the same stress that makes you resilient can break you down. So it's really the improper dosing and inability to cope with that load and that stress that creates the problems. But um, you look at athletes who are in exam week. Like there's research talking about that people heal less efficiently. They have immune issues. So you're seeing people get sick. You're seeing that inability to adapt and cope with the demands that are placed on them being significantly altered by some other type of factor outside of a weight room or a field. I think the fact that the collegiate environment is being more aware to that, and teams are trying to push practice in the morning a little later, or they're trying to manipulate schedules so that kids aren't just running straight from class, but they have a little time between to get some type of snack in, to have some moment to themselves, to take a couple breaths before they go out. And on the flip side, right after practice, are they running directly into a test or something, or are they actually able to have a little moment to themselves where they can kind of down regulate, take everything in, and then move on? I think that those types of things, while are not massive, are significant because they happen 10 to 20 times every day over the span of weeks and years. And that's really the problem, is that chronic buildup of a overactivated sympathetic response that may be exacerbated by an athlete's type A, their personality, their type A personality of, hey, I'm driven, I'm a high performer, this is what I do, or maybe some of the lifestyle stuff. So maybe that there's somebody who, is just pumping refined sugars into their body and creating a flux in blood sugar regulation that again mobilizes cortisol, a sympathetic response, and next thing you know, you've just in the span of 3 hours tagged on six different things, albeit slightly different, that had the same outcome on the system. So that internal response becomes very, very sensitive to everything you're doing because it's that chronic buildup that's really taken its toll on it.
Interesting. So you bring up the idea of the sympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system being broken down, I guess being partnered with, I should say, with the parasympathetic nervous system, right? And that makes up your autonomic nervous system. So for those of you not familiar, sympathetic nervous systems, your fight or flight, it mobilizes energy. It's looked at to be very important for survival. If we saw a lion during evolutionary times, it would help us increase our heart rate, increase oxygen supply, mobilize energy so we could run away from a lion. But then we'd have the parasympathetic aspect. That branch would help regulate rest and digest, and kind of the repair and rebuild process. Now, with that, you mentioned the hyperactivity of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, does this get out of whack sometimes if you're an athlete, you're an individual, where you're chronically stressed? And if so, does that affect some of your endocrinology, so how your body responds? And what kind of tips can you have, you use with your athletes or yourself to get yourself back into a parasympathetic state?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think and not to correct you, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I think that the key is not to constantly counteract sympathetic, but is to bring the body back into a more balanced ability to appropriately turn on sympathetic and to appropriately turn on parasympathetic. And what you typically see, and I said it, so I think you're totally right, is sympathetic does become the primary driver. But it isn't all about just turning on sympathetic. It's having the ability to use both when you need it. And I think a lot of times the door or the window to that is to drive parasympathetic activity on so that it can kind of restore itself. And then the goal, once you're kind of in ability where you have a little bit more of stability in that, is then to have access to both. So
So
I
you
think,
talked to me about, I don't mean to interrupt, Chase, but this is something that just reminded me completely,
yeah,
where if someone is chronically sympathetic, let's say they're in a game situation, this kind of goes back to that being stressed out. They might have hyperactivity of the sympathetic nervous system, and correct me if I'm wrong, this desensitizes the frontal cortex and reduces some individuals' ability to make decisions, especially when fatigue begins to set in, because you have multiple areas of stress coming to the body, fatigue, the actual stress emotional of the situation, and then the person's internal ability to regulate that. That's something you had talking to me about and spoken with me about while at Stanford. And I found that topic to be extremely interesting, and due to the fact that it's completely universal, whether you're an athlete or you're an individual going in for a job interview, they kind of fall under the same umbrella. Is this the case?
yes, excuse me. So I think ultimately it's a fine line, right? So I think the sympathetic nervous system actually has been shown to enhance some cognitive activities, right? So it does increase that acute ability to recall some information, and at the same time, an overdriven response of it can almost shut everything down, and that's where you see people kind of like getting up, hyperventilating, and not being able to perform, and really kind of altering some type of thoughtful, logical, rational action. So I think it comes down to two primary things. It's a primary and secondary appraisal, and this is a psychology-based concept, but I think it applies basically to everything in performance. And in primary, the athlete, the person, whoever is going to say what is happening, and this is subconscious and happening in different aspects of the brain, the amygdala and the hypothalamus, but your body goes, what is this? Right? So I look at the analogy of you walk into a bar, all right, you scan the bar, you have a very, very fast action, or I'm sorry, excuse me, decision about what is in that bar. Is it a threat? Do you see a bunch of Hell's Angels with guns and baseball bats sitting there, or do you see a bunch of friends? Right. So, and then it's that same split second, a secondary appraisal happens to the primary. That secondary being, do I have the resources to cope with this? And that is really what dictates what type of response the ANS is going to send, or the brain will send to the body to stimulate what side of the autonomic nervous system, right? So if I walk in, I say, "What? I don't like this." Two, hey, I've been in this scenario before. It didn't go well. That's when that sympathetic's going to kick on because I got to get out of here. Versus I walk into that same place, it's a bunch of friends, it's my old buddy from college. You're going to have a completely different mobilization of neurotransmitters, of hormones, because of your perception of the stressor is completely different. And you mentioned eustress, distress, and I think that that's the case for everything because not to go on a rant, but if you take an athlete who loves running, that stress of running is completely different than an athlete who doesn't like running, right? So their perception of an activity, albeit the same activity, will have a different psychophysiological manifestation of stress or load on the body. And so I think as we talk about mental toughness with our athletes and all of that, ultimately comes down to have you put them in situations to prepare them to have confidence in them? And that's what's going to dictate some of these positive body responses that you'll see because they'll walk up to that play and go, "Yep, done this a million times." And that is where you kind of have that mental resilience versus, "I don't know what's going to happen. I've never done this before. If I miss, it's going to be the game." And I think when we talk about all of performance and psychology and physiology, it's so intertwined. You cannot separate them. And we like to separate things. We like to have absolutes. We like to wear a monitor on our wrist or our chest that tells us we're tired or that tells us we've been too stressed. But the reality is that the individual differences in perception of stress and my body's ability to adapt to that stress, based on what type of internal environment is kind of walking around 24 hours a day, is going to dictate everything. And that's why it's really tough in a team environment for us to just blast everybody and say, we're going to stress, we're going to do internal load monitoring via HRV. Well, that's fantastic. And I think there's merit to that. So I'm not saying there isn't, but you better make sure you know a lot about your athletes. You better make sure you have the time to learn about their personalities, how they handle things, what type of family experiences they've had, what type of things go into them making decisions about what they're experiencing.
Gotcha. So that's, yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that's beautifully said. One of the things you mentioned there was the idea of HRV, but also the idea of perception. So HRV being a reflection of the autonomic nervous system, and compared to your own baseline, when your HRV number is lower, it means you have less variability, which essentially is inferring a higher level of sympathetic drive. And when your HRV is higher, it infers a more balanced state or a more parasympathetic state, or essentially less sympathetic,
Right.
right? And so we start using HRV and we talk about that as an internal tool. They also mentioned the idea of having individuals be in situations that are similar to that of sport. Do you think there's a time and place for real-time HRV feedback and HRV training? And would you possibly put someone in a situation where they're trying to score that goal, or maybe you fatigue them with, say, a sled push or a prowler push, and then you have their HRV tank and they have to perform a difficult technical task in an attempt to have them auto-regulate that HRV so they can perform that task successfully, making training and skill development much more specific and beginning to mesh together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's biofeedback 101, right? That's thought technology, heart math, all those companies out there using that with performance psychologists, to see how people a handle the stressors implied on them, but how do they bounce back? So the military's been doing this for years and live monitoring HRV on some of the operators, and then watching them perform, their training, going through selection and training phases where they have to um, handle extremely dynamic and challenging environments where they're under watch. They're being scrutinized every step of the way. And so what we've actually seen is that people who, on average, it's not, there's anomalies, of course, people who take the hit, right? So you'll see a drop in HRV or an increase in sympathetic tone. They will actually bounce back though. So having a stressor impact your body is normal, but the ability to rebound and kind of come back to those norms within a relatively quick period of time is what is critical for high performance. Um, they talked about having a 5 minute or a 300 beat average prior to that activity to get a baseline. What we found, and some of the research is coming out now, you can actually probably cut it down to 1 to 3 minutes, right? So it becomes much more, I guess, logistically feasible to have guys sit around for 1 to 3 minutes, kind of collect that quote unquote baseline, and then go about their day. And that's really critical to get that daily baseline, because as we talked about, if you're on day 6 of a long week, your body is functioning and flowing uh, in kind of repair mode. It's trying to keep up with what you've been putting it through. So each day that you wake up, you are going to be slightly different than what you were before. So it's not an apples to apples. You got to look at your ability to flux, and that allostatic load, and your body's proactive decision making to try and match what it was doing in the prior days to that training evolution.
Gotcha. So HRV itself, I refer to it as a check engine light because it doesn't necessarily come from one area. It can come from emotional, and you can stub your toe, you can have a lower HRV. And some of the things I've been reading about lately and talking to you about off this podcast or text message, and kindly enough, you respond to my random texts at 9:30 at night with a slew of articles and 10 questions, has been the
Yep.
nutritional side, right? And the idea of low-level systemic inflammation or inadequate nutrition. What I mean by that is that we're putting food into our body under the assumption that this is going to give us a positive effect. But really, sometimes the foods that we put into our body are causing a stressor on our system because either A, they're so foreign to us in regards to the way they're processed, or B, the simple sugars in them, and I mean simple in terms of you're eating a Fruit Loop, have an effect on our body that can take us down a road that necessarily isn't positive for adaptation. And just like HRV is affected by your psychological perception, I've been reading a little bit about how HRV is a kind of a systemic monitor and how it can be influenced by nutrition. In regards to that nutritional aspect, I know we've talked a little bit about biomarkers and
Yep.
some of the diving deep into internal medicine and understanding that our body is very complex. It's made up of all these subsystems, and how one subsystem acts might affect how another subsystem acts. And as we gain these risk factors of inadequate nutrient status, our overall risk profile increases. And the idea that we might have an emergent pattern in terms of an illness manifest increases. So I want to hear some of your thoughts on some of the internal medicine, where that's going in regards to biomarkers for athletics, human performance, and just general wellness. I know you're not a physician and you're not ordering blood work and diagnosing off blood work, but being a sports scientist, I do think it's important to appreciate and understand some of these concepts. And you have a great in-depth knowledge in this area, so I'd love to hear a little more about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's an area, and by no means am I an expert, right? I just read a lot of things and copy what other people say. So I have to always say that, that's what we always kind of hang our hat on, is that if you go through the research, you're basically taking somebody else's thoughts, interpreting them to your own. So my experiences with this are personal and what I've seen in the professional setting. And I'll kind of touch on the personal piece because I think, as we talked about being an athlete and understanding what people go through, our own experiences can drive a lot of how we make decisions with our athletes or our clients or whoever we're working with. And that basically for 25 years of my life, I've been on some form of allergy medicine, allergy shot, decongestant, Z-Pack to get rid of a sinus infection. You name it, I had it, and I had multiple sinus infections every year. And not one time I went to ear, nose, and throat doctors. I went to allergy specialists. Not one time did anyone ever bring up, what are you putting in your body? And it took, I went to a Dr. Jim LaValle seminar last summer, and it took somebody, well, he's very good, but it took somebody to kind of like say, hey man, like, it's not just isolating the symptom and giving you an antihistamine or something like that. You got to think that you're in a systemic state of inadequacy. Your body doesn't have the ability to recognize normal nutrients as you eat things, but then also it doesn't have the ability to recognize um, some of the, I guess, the things that are supposed to be normal now become pathological, and it's just a complete dysfunctional cycle. And so for me, I literally just he said, "Hey, do me a favor, stop eating dairy." Okay, yeah, I love cheese, but we'll do that. And I literally, and within 3 to 4 days, every single allergy symptom I had went away. I haven't had any issues for 7.5 months. I haven't taken a
Wow.
single thing. I haven't had any issues. I haven't gotten sick once, and it was just one thing. I come to find out, I have a lactose allergy, and not only did it affect me like with GI distress, but it affects chronic states of allergies. So my body was perceiving things as the enemy, and the immune system was essentially creating that inflammatory response to deal with them. So I think that first and foremost, I started just looking at maybe people are eating things that they may have a low grade inflammatory response to. I was taking NSAIDs. I was taking NSAIDs like they were candy since I was 16 years old. Being an athlete, you get off home off practice, your knees hurt, your ankle hurts, whatever happens, you just take them so that you can, um, keep on going to practice the next day. Um, I was taking Z-Paks, I was taking prednisone. All these things basically put my body in a state of shock to a point where it couldn't actually regulate normal immune function. And so to kind of take that into my work and professional environment, and we have athletes who are under that significant academic stress, social stress, and then physical stress. But what we also see is they're just like me, and then they were taking NSAIDs, they were taking, prednisone, they were taking corticosteroids for asthma, exercise-induced asthma. They were taking all these things that basically is driving the body into a state of alarm where it doesn't have a normalcy to it. So we're not seeing the immune system actually do its job. We're seeing a chronic sympathetic response basically to everything that's being put into the body. And so with that low grade inflammation that's happening over weeks, months, years, you get that inability to handle external loads. Then that's where that internal load becomes so critical. But what were once is maybe a resilient person, now they're getting the sniffles every 3 weeks. Now they're walking around with some type of telfemoral tendonitis. And I think that we so easily look at, oh, they landed on it funny in practice. Oh, they took a bump or a bruise for somebody, but maybe that is exacerbated, or maybe that's highly sensitive due to the fact that the body isn't able to function under normal circumstances.
No, that's there's a lot of topics in there I want to dive into. Um, I guess one of those immediate topics that's most applicable for individuals is the idea of NSAIDs and how, I mean, when I was in middle school, I must have taken maybe six, 4 or 5 before a game when I was playing, and it felt nothing of it. I can only imagine what that's doing to my internal, my stomach and my gastric system and how much it's chewed up. There's actually been a lot of information that's come out regarding tendon healing and
Yep.
the adaptations of it. You were, I think, the first one to bring this to my attention, and some of the detriments of NSAID itself, and some of the alternatives we could possibly have, such as curcumin and things that don't necessarily tear our system up. If you have any thoughts on that and how that might play a role, then okay, we have this functional medicine world. Now, how do we apply that into physical therapy? And if we're trying to have tendon adaptations in regards to isometrics, we might be doing them to increase longevity and reduce tendinopathy. Or if we're filling someone up with NSAIDs, are we really getting the bang for the buck that we want to get, or are we just causing more harm than good?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you said it right there, and that are you taking that risk reward on using that, I guess, short term, uh, that pill to, is it overriding what you truly want in the long term? Okay, so we talked about adaptation. You mentioned it. Well, we've seen that NSAIDs actually have a destruction of satellite cells. So when you're normally building muscle and you're having some of these repair cells come in to help stimulate regeneration, NSAIDs will actually blunt that response. So COX1 and 2, being the primary enzymes associated with that, will actually get shut down. And when they do, you're literally stopping your body from adapting and growing. So I talk to my soccer team all the time about it. I'm like, guys, if you guys you're wearing those sleeveless shirts, you want to fill those things out. Let's not take away from what already isn't there. And I think when we start looking at, as you mentioned it, healing and that early stage return to play, and I'm never going to say, hey, you shouldn't do that. That's always up to the doctors and the medical professionals. But I think that there's lack of thought for long term maladaptation. So you mentioned it. Do we alter collagen proliferation um, for the expense of just taking down some swelling and irritation? Maybe that pain response can be better handled by Tylenol or whatever else somebody thinks. Because I think it's critical, especially, you see the two different primary types of collagen, of type 1 and type 3. They've seen that there is a blunted response and how that tendon regenerates. And so I think, little things like that, those conversations you have with your athletic trainer or your doctor, and be like, hey, is this absolutely necessary? Like, I'm not questioning your rationale, but does this athlete need that, or is there something else we can do
Hmm.
that's going to make sure that when I am doing BFR or whatever, or BFR isos to maximize tendon thickness or tendon restructuring or whatever I'm doing, are we going to throw baby out with the bathwater? Are we going to hurt something, for the expense of, what's easy and what we know from a Western medical model?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the things, by the way, I want to clarify for those not familiar with terminology, NSAIDs are sorry, Chase, I'll let you go ahead. They interrupt you real quick. Um,
Yep.
NSAIDs are things like ibuprofen and Advil, um, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. What's the D stand for? I'm forgetting right now. I feel
Drugs.
stupid now. Drugs. Oh, yeah, okay, there you go. Yeah, perfect. Um, Things like ibuprofen and um, Advil. I used to take again like 6 Advils before I played basketball because when it came out, I knew no better. It made my knee feel better, and take more the merrier. But again, it's coming out that we're really tearing up our system. But what's interesting is when you look at some of the inflammation studies, you look at older adults, it brings up the idea that as we age, we get in such an inflammatory state. We're taking things like NSAIDs, which are known to possibly reduce adaptations in individuals who are healthy. It actually increases muscle growth in some of those older adults because their level of inflammation is so high systemically that taking something as like an NSAID or Advil, which we think is bad,
Right.
actually increases adaptation. And they just showed, I just read a paper probably 30 minutes before this that showed curcumin has the potential effects to do the same, which might be a healthier alternative to NSAIDs in regards to reducing inflammation. And one topic I want to get onto that you mentioned it up and you opened the can of worms on this, so I blame you, is blood flow restriction training. You called it BFR. And for anyone listening, Chase is the one of the most well-versed individuals in this area. I was I learn from him probably weekly on it, and I get studies from him. It used to be daily, probably a little less consistent now because he's probably realizing that I can't read that fast. But I'm going to Chase to talk a little bit about some of the protocols that you use BFR and how you can use it for not just athletic development, but for individuals who might just be seeking an alternative way to work out, whether it be older adults, people who travel on the road, and what it does physiologically for not only muscle growth, but the tendon thickness, like you said, and some of the other protocols, such as cellular swelling protocols.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, the one thing I would say about our previous conversation with the NSAIDs thing is I'm not telling people not to take them. I'm not like running around saying that that's the devil and all that. So I make sure that I'm not like one of those zealots about that stuff. It's just, hey, do you need it? Like, just that thought process is critical. Is this necessary? Not, let me just pop them because I'm sore today. Right. I think that's the caveat I want people to walk away with, is that everything is necessary if it's necessary. And if it's not, is there a better alternative, or is it just part of life? Is that part of being a Division 1 athlete, or somebody who's recreationally fit? Is you're going to feel a little sore and tired? Is it necessary to take that pill that may negatively affect you? So I think that's one thing I wanted to say. But kind of moving on to the
You are
BFR
not
stuff.
a zealot. I will
Yeah,
vouch for it.
yeah,
It's just an interesting topic to talk about, and I give you credit for being open-minded on both ends. So,
yeah. So,
if
so I think,
anyone was concerned,
yeah, yeah. I wanted to throw that out there. But I think with the BFR stuff, it's so I've learned a lot from a man, Dr. Ed Lacera. He works with the Smart Tools company, which they're just absolutely revolutionizing how available and the education that's associated with blood flow restriction. So I'm going to kind of pass on that credit and say that they're really pushing the field forward. And I'm not affiliated with the company. I just think what they're doing is fantastic work, because blood flow restriction obviously has been around for a long time. It's not new. Uh, we're not pretending it's new, but it's really the availability of cuffs for affordable prices is made it seem, refreshed and kind of a new life to it. Started in the late 90s, Japan really doing a lot of the early research on it. A lot of people started with tying off with different straps and bands that they're just wrapping around their arms and looking for, in a partial occlusion, in some cases, probably dangerously at full ischemia. But I think you saw it in most recent years with some of the Owens recovery and the Delphis, which come at a pretty high price tag. And as I mentioned, Smart Tools has come out. They have much more affordable. I think it's a tenth of the price, and so now you're able to put these types of this tool and everybody's hands. And I think it's changing the landscape as far as a modality that has multiple uses. And that's one thing when we talk sports science, we talk technology. Everything has a time and place. But when I look and evaluate and vet out technology or whatever we're going to bring on as a new resource, I always look for it to have multiple uses. Does it have a bang for your buck? And I think the blood flow restriction does. It's versatile. It can be used in rehab. It can be used to build muscle. It can be used for strength. It can be used as an activity potentiator. So you can use it to potentially increase your subsequent performance with an acute time window. You can use it as a recovery tool. So I think the utilization of it is still, we're learning about it. There's still no definitive, here's how this happens in this sequence. But I think that's with everything, right? The human body, we're learning so much about it. But the science that's there has proven that low load with blood flow restriction, where we were occluding 100% venous return, but partially occluding arterial inflow. So there is blood flow going into the muscles and the periphery, but there is no blood flow returning. And so it creates a pooling effect where essentially you're going to limit the availability of oxygen. You're going to decrease the pH, become more acidic. You're going to deplete phosphocreatine stores. You're essentially going to run through the size principle and use up small, slow twitch fibers and skip essentially right to fast twitch fibers with a low load or even a non-loaded exercise. So I think when you talk about somebody who's got limitations, maybe they just had surgery, they can't run, they can't have the impulse or the impact that you would need or you would want to see to kind of develop the musculature as they come back. Blood flow restriction is a great way because it takes a low load exercise and utilizes that restricted pooling, and you get a subsequent fast twitch adaptation. So you're stimulating the big boys, the ones that move us, the ones that make us jump and run faster. And I think you're seeing time windows of adaptation that are a sixth of the time faster. You're getting strength and hypertrophy adaptation in 2 weeks, whereas in traditional resistance training, it was taking 8 to 12. And when you talk about, I had an athlete roll their ankle, and I want to make sure that they're not having atrophy as they walk around in a boot. I need to make sure that the muscles around the knees and the hamstrings, the VMO, the VL, all those critical drivers in sport aren't just wasting away. So we would have athletes, obviously in the rehab setting, doing protocols to develop muscle, but also just sitting. The act of just sitting with occlusion passively, not doing anything, has been shown to cut atrophy by 50%. So
Wow.
it's fantastic because it's non-invasive. You're not doing anything to them. They're just sitting. So we don't, promote them to play on their phones constantly, but they can sit there and have their phone out and, 20 minutes goes by and they just hopefully, you know, benefited their return to play in a, a faster, more efficient way than just sitting around. So lots of utility for it.
Interesting. So, for those not familiar, blood flow restriction training, the way it works, you got a cuff. Um, Hopefully a cuff, not just an elastic band you're tying on, but that's how it started. originally from Katu training out in Japan. So it's a cuff that attaches proximally on the limb, typically up by the shoulder or up along the thigh, and it occludes the amount of blood, so reduces the amount of blood go into the muscle, which then allows these series of physiological effects that Chase alluded to. Now, there's a difference between venous and arterial occlusion. And Chase, in regards to that, what are some of the specifics of it for people who aren't as familiar with blood flow? You rattle off a bunch of stuff regarding blood flow and some of the adaptations of it, but people who aren't familiar with it, you measure the occlusion through Doppler. And I believe Smart Tools uses a remote Doppler that you attach to on the distal limb. And when using this, what percentages do you use? How do you know is it too much occlusion? Is it too tight? Is it not tight enough? And then what are the protocols that you use once you have the right occlusion for that limb to increase some of these hypertrophy, so muscle growing activities, or just sitting there playing on your phone activities that reduces hypertrophy for your athletes?
Yeah. So what you're doing is you're actually going to take an external Doppler or something that's going to allow you to magnify the sound of the pulse, right? So if you take radial pulse, right here, you would place the Doppler on it, and you would actually be able to hear the heartbeat as it pumps through, just doosh, doosh, doosh. And up top, they're wearing the cuff. You're going to slowly start to inflate it. It gets tighter, 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 and you will eventually get to a point where that pulse will start to fade of doosh, 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 and it comes to a point where it's non-existent. And so that's when you know that there's been full arterial occlusion. That's their 100%. There is no blood flow into that arm. There is no blood flow out. It is occluded. And so research has shown that basically anywhere from 30% to 90%, you're going to have the same amount of occlusion. So if I was to explain that a little bit more detail so I'm going to take that 100% occlusion number. So if you've ever done your blood pressure, and the typical one of perfect blood pressure is 120/80, and that's the same device we're going to use. I mean, it's a sphygmomanometer, the tough one to say. And you're going to get a number up there, like let's just say 250. All right. So that's your 100% occlusion. What, again, research has shown is that in 30% of 250, all the way up to 90% of 250, that's the sweet spot for occluding arterial that actually doesn't improve occlusion as the higher you go. So we stick to 50%. So, 50% of 250 is 125. And you're going to have just as much as if you did it at 90%. And really the difference is pain perception. Because if you start getting up to 100% occlusion and telling somebody to exercise, they're not going to like it. It's not going to feel good. So it's a nice sweet spot of saying, hey, we have the occluded arterial, but not fully restricted, but we have restricted venous, but we can still move and be active. And so with that, what you're really looking to do, there's a 30-15-15-15 protocol that's seen pretty commonly, but ultimately you just need to fatigue the muscles. You need to have a low load exercise that's done for high volume, typically 15 plus reps for multiple sets with a minimal rest period. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to allow for blood to be pumped into the muscle. You're going to actively, contract over time. It's going to stimulate fast twitch fibers. You're going to rest for a very short period. More blood flow is going to go to the area. It's going to keep getting more acidic. It's going to keep activating more fast twitch, and you're going to just repeat that. And so, I mean, it really, really magnifies the response of typically a weight or a resistance that would be almost no impact on you at all. You would have no performance benefit from using a weight that light. So you can really use it as, in a rehab setting with an athlete who has very little capability to handle load, or you could use it as a finisher and you're a bodybuilder and you want to stimulate a muscle group that's lagging and you really want to build it up. And it's the fantastic thing I think about it is it's a minimally damaging activity. And what I mean by that is that you're going to have a dramatic reduction in creatine stores, so CK levels, myoglobin. You're not going to get the same mechanical breakdown that you see with typical resistance training. So when we start talking about internal load and HRV, if you were to substitute an in-season lift with BFR, you're still going to get strength and hypertrophy adaptation without the potential systemic load that maybe a typical resistance training session does. So now you start talking about minimizing internal responses, but still getting adaptation. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's something so I've seen personally as well. I use smart tools. Smart tools I'm not affiliated with. I'm a big fan of them because they made it affordable for individuals like you and myself to actually use them.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about occlusion, we're talking about reducing the amount of arterial occlusion, but not the amount of venous occlusion. So you're allowing blood to pool to an extent. You get large amounts of dilation. You increase the amount of capillaries in that area, but you're also not breaking down the muscle in the same way that you would otherwise. So when you're lifting a heavy load, you have the fibers themselves begin to essentially tear apart, and your body has to rebuild these. But now we're increasing hypertrophy, so growing the muscle without having to have this breakdown response in the muscle itself. But with that being said, the loads that you're using are also 20% of your 1 rep max. So a very, very light load you're using to fatigue. How does that affect the tendon itself? Because one thing I've noticed personally, and this is, I'm not saying you should do this. Okay, this is something I did, and it's maybe stupid or whatever you want to call it. I had a really bad tendinopathy issue on my knee where I couldn't play basketball. I couldn't go upstairs well. And I did BFR traditional training where I had tempo work. But when I started doing BFR low level plyometrics, when I started inducing some of those shearing forces on the tendon to increase adaptation in that area that otherwise might not be there with a low load, I started to see much better results in my knee compared to some of the tempo work. Now, do you do anything specifically with BFR that might target the tendon outside of the traditional 30 reps, 15 reps, 15 reps, 15 reps with a low load?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think some of the isometrics that we talked about when you were working at Stanford and having that analgesic effect, so having the ability to have pain mitigation in acute windows of 15 to 45 minutes, but also the collagen proliferation. So you're getting an increase in human growth hormone that is like 170% times greater after a workout, which we know HGH doesn't necessarily build bigger muscles, but it does stimulate collagen growth. So when you're having somebody who is maybe coming back from a ruptured Achilles or another, itis or osis issue, it's a great way to help promote an environment in maybe an avascular area, and it kind of forces nutrients and a hormonal shift that may promote a more healing environment. I think we talked about briefly the training piece. I think the more that you can start to get people into, I'm not an overly dramatic sports specific person, but I think the more you can get people into activities that are going to be replicated on the field, whether it's sled pushes and walks, or whether it's having some type of you know uh, activity if you're a pitcher where you're getting your arm through these ranges of motions that are going to be necessary while using the inclusion is actually going to promote a lot of ongoing benefit, I think, to rehabilitate the area in a functional manner, and develop not only the musculature but also promote the properties around that specific tissue that needs to be healed. So I think there's some really cool things that are just now kind of being played with, just because we can actually dial in the proper occlusions. We can actually dial in what we want to see happen with you, whether it's some of the cell swell protocols that we're doing, or the ischemic preconditioning protocols, where we're having athletes sit for extended period of time passively with their occlusion set, and then they're going to reperfuse. We're going to allow blood flow back in, and we're going to do that at repeated intervals prior to activity, and see potential for increased power output, oxygen kinetics. Uh, the research is pretty amazing with some of the ischemic preconditioning, and that they're seeing um, increased time to exhaustion, decreased time trial performances, but they don't really know why. There isn't like a clear mechanism for performance gain um, that's been totally identified just yet. There has been stuff where it's shown to attenuate lactate levels, So you obviously know cellular respiration is enhanced because you're not getting that amount of hydrogen present in the blood. So you're maybe potentially a more efficient energy user, using more fat and oxygen. So that's great there. But I think as the research starts catching up, that piece is that's one thing that I'm looking at doing for my research focus for school is that potentiation piece. If I'm already going to be sitting around before a game, or if I'm going to have time between events like a track and field event or a pool event, and I know I can sit here passively, not use energy, provide a stimulus to the body that's going to potentially open up neural pathways or physiological mechanisms to increase contractibility of the muscles, I'm going to then maybe get that extra tenth of a second. I'm going to throw an extra, couple feet on the javelin. I'm going to do whatever I need to do, potentially at a higher level. And I think that's really, as we're pushing towards performance, why do you choose during the game? Like, you want to increase performance, you want to run longer. And I think this is going to add one more little layer to it, that from an investment piece is minimally invasive, is minimally changing to their schedule. They don't have to do anything crazy. They feel good. I think that's the biggest thing, is the anecdotal feedback on it is, man, I feel great. I feel like I don't have to do a full warm up. I feel like I can just kind of get out there, move around. We still have them do stuff, but they just feel like they've warmed up faster. And I think uh, that piece is going to be really cool to see if we can demonstrate some empirical evidence on it.
Yeah, no, that I'm excited to see the research, and I know you're working hard on it. It's kind of a great topic you brought up. It kind of really brings us full circle because you look at BFR, it increases the acidity in the area and lactate production. It increases autonomic nervous system arousal, which has been shown both to increase cognitive abilities, neuroplasticity, and the ability to enhance memory. And so while you're doing this, it's also not only priming the body for the upcoming activity, but you're also priming the body as a whole in regards to its mental capacity and not just the muscular area. And so when you start looking at that, full system of the human body, and how we kind of talked about a little bit here, some dynamical systems where, the body is really complex and what happens in one area affects another, right? You can't differentiate between your physical and mental side, because the
Right.
physical side of BFR is now enhancing your mental side, just like your perception can enhance a workout. And so you
Oh yeah.
have feedback up and feedback back down. And that's
Yeah.
just a great, highlight you brought up, because now it's really inclusive, where we're so often thinking in this isolated manner, oh, if we bench this or if we run this, this will happen. But we don't think about it in this recursive loop manner, where what I do to my muscle, right? Our muscle releases these myokines that go talk to our brain, which then go back and talk to our muscle. And we have the endocrine system working together to orchestrate this all. And just the whole idea of BFR before a game, it's not just, right, the muscles and the ischemic preconditioning, but it's also the fact that you're putting the person in a state that's more conducive to the performance itself. Because so often, and this isn't to go on a rant, and I apologize, and this is something you and I have talked about, right? We're not avoiding the sympathetic state, right? We don't want to be sitting there before a game doing deep belly breathing, because we need to be ready to roll.
Yep.
There's a reason why you get excited in these situations. And it's just a really excellent full loop example of how it all kind of comes together there.
Yeah, I think one last little piece with that too is lactate has been shown in exercise, but specifically lactate now too, has been associated with BDNF, right? So that brain-derived neurotrophic factor that exercise stimulates, kind of like miracle grow for the brain. And that if you're sitting around watching, a lecture for an hour, get up, do 10 squats, walk around, and all of a sudden you have a renewed focus. And so with that, to your point of it's all connected, is you have an athlete who potentially is going to get a benefit from that. But we're also, and they'll never watch this, so I'll say it. Is I'm implanting that placebo. My verbiage is really careful. And hey, just so you know, you wear this 15 minutes before you do some ISOs, your ankle will feel better. It has an ability to mitigate pain. Like, I'm implanting that sense of this is going to work because placebo effect works. We know it does. So there's a little bit of, mix of art and science and how we imply these technologies, and saying, hey, like, hey, Logan, just so you know, you wear this before that game, your ankle will feel better. You're going to feel looser. You're going to feel faster, and just letting them roll with that, and don't need to tell them anything else. And I think that, to your point of it's all connected, can then maximize um, whatever intervention you want to then increase performance.
Yeah, and I'll avoid a rant here. I'll keep it short, I promise. But what you hit on is perfect, especially in the sense that look at some of the studies regarding tendons. They'll look at it and see that the tendon itself is healthy, yet they feel pain. And they've done a lot of studies where they're saying an external stimulus, so something like a metronome in the background going ping, 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 and you're focused on the stimulus instead of the pain, and you now begin to deassociate your knee with pain because the stimulus in regards to the tempo that's going on in the background, you're doing it while you're doing an exercise. So now because you're focused on this external stimulus while during exercise, you begin to disassociate pain with your, you know, knee or tendon during that movement. And it just really shows how coupled the system is and how our brain talks to our body. And if we perceive that we're healthy, right? You said, oh, mixing the art and the science. Well, you're mixing the science and the science, right? You understand that perception is reality. And it's not necessarily, we like to call it art because there's no number to put behind it. But really it's, the science that our body is deeply interconnected and that how our neurons from the brain talk to our muscles, how our muscles talk back to our brain are all essentially one, and how everything from your nutrition to your perception to your stress from school, your emotional state, whether you got a text message from someone that made you upset, all affects your internal load of the body itself. And regardless of what external load we put, and no matter how hard you want to work, if your internal system isn't able to handle the stimulus you're going to put on it in terms of the load you're going to give, then what we're doing is it's really falling short of what we're actually trying to accomplish, because we're essentially using external load to infer what's going on. But there's so many things that go on inside the body outside of external load that if we're only using one system to monitor the internal system, we're kind of, I don't want to say falling short, but not maybe doing all that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think not to rant myself, but that's one of the biggest mistakes that we as S&C practitioners make is the assumption with general adaptation syndrome theory that you're getting people and that they're adapting at the rate and to the dose that you think is appropriate, that we're making that assumption as to where they're at. So when we say, oh, they're at homeostasis and we're going to imply 2 weeks of a loading scheme and then we're going to unload and then we're going to push it higher because they're going to super compensate. I think that is a load of crap. I think that we want that to be the case because we want to feel justified and feel good at what we do. But in many cases, you really have to dial in all the factors associated with overreaching, all the factors associated with performance, and mix them and have checks and balances to see truly if somebody is where you think they are and if you got them to where they are. And if not, what was the reason why? Was there an energy insufficiency? Was there a micronutrient problem? Was there associated stress damaging the functioning, the HPA axis? All those things have, they come into play, but we are so rigid and a lot of our thinking, me included, I'm totally guilty of this. We work in 4 to 6 week blocks. Oh yeah, my unload's going to be at week 3. Well, maybe your unload should be at week 9. Like how do you know that they're not ready for more and more and more? Um, so that I think that assumption of not necessarily taking into consideration that connectedness between all these systems um, can get us into trouble. It can make us have false positives. I think we really can grasp onto stuff that's not there.
No, that's couldn't be said better, because we like to make it simple because we can understand simple. And when we make it complex, we realize we don't really understand that much. But the
Mhm.
more we appreciate that's complex, the more we can appreciate how applying something simple, like we think a load, 10 push-ups, really isn't as simple as it may be. And that at times can cause paralysis by analysis, where you have so many things going on at once and to consider. I'm not saying that we need to sit there and measure every single subsystem, and I know you're not either. But the idea that we need to appreciate that and see where can we maybe refer to, turn to, that isn't just in the lane of how much weight do we lift and how much load do we give someone, but what other factors could be involved in that athlete's life that's not giving the results that we think this external load should be leading to. And it's a great check engine light because now we have this external load. Hey, I expect you to be here in 3 months and you're not there. That's okay. Because who knows whose fault it is? It's no one's. But the idea is that now we can turn to different people because we didn't see the expected results. We can dive a little deeper. And that's allowing us to utilize our resources, whether it's a friend you know, a doctor you know, another practitioner you know, to help arm us with the information to be the best that we can be.
Yeah, and I think that's where the external load comes in, right? You got to know if they're not meeting the expectations or
Mhm.
the desired outcomes. Are they typically matching people in practice, that are similar positional demands? Are they typically being asked to do something that isn't looking normal? Then we can kind of backtrack and see how they were doing it, what the factors associated with that internal load were. And again, we don't monitor everything. We don't think it's necessary. We try and find what's appropriate for each team and scenario. But I think again, if you're mindful and you know your athletes and you know the scenario of what you're trying to put them in, you can then kind of use your coaching eye to say, okay, what are the things that I think may be influencing or providing maladaptation, towards the desired stimulant, or the desired outcome. Now, what are we doing to them that we should be seeing or think we should be seeing? And if I know them, what is potentially a confounding variable to that?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. You don't assess everything, A, because you can't, and B, no one has time, but you assess what's pertinent and you're aware of what's pertinent, and you act as a check engine light and facilitate where you can.
That's it.
That's well said because I think both ends we say, oh, let's be so simple and just do this, or let's only do this aspect over here. But when you take in consideration all of it, you allow yourself to be the best you can be in your position that you're in because you're not trying to solve everything. You're just trying to facilitate where you can. Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's perfect. Well, Chase, I don't want to hold you up too long, and I really appreciate you being here. I want to wrap it up, but before we finish it up here, I got, I guess, two questions for you,
Okay.
and I didn't send them to you ahead of time, so they're kind of. If you don't have a quick answer, that's fine. The first one is it's pretty simple. Um, I'm not gonna, I don't mean resources in terms of, oh, go to PubMed or go to this paper, but are there any individuals out there that you can possibly listen to or find that you have found to be very informative, and not just in terms of, oh, that's good information, but something that's changed the way you think about how you do your job?
Yeah, I'm talking to you right now. You've definitely challenged a lot of my thoughts and how I address some of the biomechanics and physics of what we're doing. It's definitely not an area that I'm strong in, and I think you've done a great job of putting information out there for the public to be able to digest in an easy manner. Man, a public resource. This may sound kind of cheesy and maybe a little bit of bro sciencey, but I still read T Nation and go to like all those, Jim Wendler sites and read all the West Side stuff. And I think you can't isolate sports science and say, oh, it's just data, or oh, it's just pumping out research out of a lab, or oh, it's physiology, or it's technology. I think each practitioner is going to have their own flavor and what they like and what they bring to the table. And I think that we need to cater to that. That each person should say, hey, this is what I'm good at. These are my skills. I want to learn more about X. And if X so happens to be baseball and throwing and overhead athletes, then you're going to find the Mike Reinholds, the Eric Cressys, and really dive into that. And if you want to know about traditional periodization schemes and force plates, you're going to look at the Stone stuff. You're going to look at half. You're going to look at people who were early pioneers in it. So I think I don't have a necessarily a one person to go follow, but it's more of a question to the question is, what do you want to know about? What do you like? What's something that's really really kind of hits the button for you? And then just start googling stuff. Start typing these keywords in, and people will start popping up. And I think that's my development has jumped the greatest, I guess, leaps is when I started diving into these rabbit holes of what do I want to learn about right now, and just saying for the next 2 weeks, I'm going all in on, you know, let's see, saturation of muscle oxygen, SMO2. I'm just going to learn everything I can about myoglobin and hemoglobin and hematocrit and all that stuff. So it's really more about finding what you want to know at that time and just doing a deep dive, and then finding something else and doing a deep dive. And before you know it, you times years to that, and you have a well-rounded, hopefully, base of knowledge to pull from.
And my last question for you, Chase, and this might be a tough one for you to answer, being that you are the ghost of social media, yeah, the king of trolling my page.
Yes,
If
I love
people
it.
are interested, if people are interested in following up on what you're doing, where can they find more information about yourself? What links or handles, either Twitter, Instagram, would you advise them to look up into and keep a tab on yourself?
So the only thing I'm using is I have an Instagram at @Chase Phelps. So it's simple. I like to troll you and pipe in every now and then, but that's basically what I got. I got a couple posts up there, but maybe if I get a little help, we'll see how it grows.
Yeah, I highly advise you guys following him because we can need to push him to post more stuff. I shouldn't be the only one privileged to get his text messages at obscure hours, highlighting some interesting topics. I would love for it to be shared publicly, so I'm not being the third party siphoning off his knowledge and posting it.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Chase. I really appreciate you hanging in here and being able to be our first guest. Again, you're the reason why I wanted you on first. You played a big role in my development and continue to, and we all wish the best for you. It really was great to have you here, and thank you.
All right, man. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you guys for listening. Again, my handle here is at strong_by science. Oh, I did that all wrong. It's at strong_by_science. I should know my own handle by now if I use Instagram. I think my Twitter's handles at strong_science. Who knows? We'll make a link to it. We'll be sharing this podcast here shortly with different clips as well. For those of you who don't have the attention span to listen to an hour, 20-minute podcast, we'll dice some of this up. So thank you guys for listening. Really appreciate it. And take care.